Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The Halloween decorations were already up when I moved to Cedar Heights that September. Dangling skeletons and fake cobwebs covering every other porch in the neighborhood. I'd just signed the lease on a studio apartment after my divorce finalized, 37 and rebuilding from scratch, but at least the area seemed friendly enough. My coworker Jenna lived 2 blocks over and kept inviting me to things, trying to help me settle in, which is how I ended up agreeing to go to the annual Halloween block party with her group. She said the whole neighborhood went all out, shutting down 3 full streets, everyone drinking and dancing until dawn. The kind of event where you could forget your troubles for a night. I wasn't much for parties anymore, but sitting alone in my empty apartment watching horror movies didn't sound any better, and Jenna promised her friends were cool, mostly people from her book club who liked wine more than chaos. The night started perfectly normal, almost boring even, meeting Jenna and 4 others at her place around 9, everyone doing last-minute costume adjustments and pre-gaming with cheap vodka. My costume was basic, just cat ears and drawn-on whiskers since I hadn't had energy to plan anything elaborate. But Jenna had gone full witch with a velvet dress and genuine vintage hat she'd found at an estate sale. We walked over together as a group, the bass from the party already thumping 2 streets away. And I remember thinking the turnout was insane. Easily 300 people packed into the blocked-off area, with more arriving every minute. The organizers had strung lights between all the trees, set up speakers on every corner blasting a mix of classic rock and pop hits, and most houses had their doors open with people wandering in and out freely, grabbing drinks from coolers on porches, using bathrooms, treating the whole zone like one massive house party. For about 2 hours, everything was actually fun. Dancing with Jenna's friends in the middle of the street, accepting drinks from random neighbors dressed as zombies and superheroes, feeling like part of a community for the first time in months. Around midnight though, right when the party hit peak chaos, I realized I'd lost track of Jenna completely. Probably when I'd stopped to pet someone's dog dressed as a hot dog, and she'd kept walking with the others. I wandered around for maybe 20 minutes, pushing through crowds of drunk pirates and sexy nurses, checking the porches where we'd hung out earlier. But the costumes and alcohol made everyone look the same, just a blur of faces and synthetic wigs. My phone was already giving me the low battery warning, down to 12%, and when I tried calling Jenna, it went straight to voicemail. Her phone probably dead too, since she never remembered to charge it. The smart thing would have been to just walk home right then. My apartment was only 15 minutes away, but I'd had 4 or 5 drinks and felt wobbly enough that I wanted to order a ride instead. The app kept glitching though, probably from so many people in one area trying to get cars at once, showing wait times of 45 minutes or prices triple the normal rate, and my battery dropped to 7% just from having the screen on. I moved away from the main party zone, thinking maybe I'd have better luck requesting a ride from a quieter spot, walking down one of the residential streets that branched off from the celebration, where the music was more muffled and fewer people were hanging around. Most of these houses were dark, their owners either at the party or deliberately keeping lights off to avoid the chaos. But about 6 houses down, I noticed one with a carved pumpkin still glowing on the front steps, its candle flickering behind triangle eyes. The pumpkin made me assume the house was part of the party somehow, maybe a quieter spot where older neighbors were hanging out, and I figured I could knock and ask to wait inside while my phone charged just enough to call a ride. My battery had hit 3% by then, the screen dimming automatically to preserve power, and I knew I had maybe 2 minutes before it died completely. The house looked normal enough from the outside, painted beige with burgundy shutters, a swing bench on the porch that creaked slightly in the wind, one of those generic suburban homes that could belong to anyone. I knocked twice, heard footsteps almost immediately, and the door opened to reveal a man probably in his 50s, wearing just regular clothes, khakis, and a button-down shirt like he'd been working from home or something. No costume at all, which seemed weird for Halloween night, but not alarming exactly. He had this really warm smile, the kind that crinkles the corners of the eyes, and before I could even explain my situation, he said I looked lost and asked if I needed help. His voice was gentle, concerned in that neighborly way, and when I explained about my phone dying and needing to call a ride, he immediately stepped aside and gestured for me to come in, saying, of course, no problem at all. He had a charger in the kitchen I could use. The inside of his house was weirdly pristine, like a model home or something. Everything beige and cream-colored. No personal photos on the walls, just generic landscape paintings and a bowl of decorative orbs on the coffee table. The smell hit me right away too. This intense pine cleaner scent mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Almost metallic, but not quite. And I remember thinking he must have just deep cleaned before the party weekend. He led me through the living room to the kitchen, walking with this measured pace like he was giving me a tour, pointing out the bathroom down the hall in case I needed it, mentioning the house had been in his family for years, though he'd just recently moved back. The kitchen was as spotless as the rest of the house, white cabinets that looked freshly painted, granite countertops without a single crumb or water spot, and he pulled out a phone charger from a drawer that was organized with dividers for everything, batteries in one section, cables in another, everything labeled with a label maker. He plugged it into an outlet near the breakfast nook and gestured for me to sit at the small table there, asking if I wanted water or coffee while I waited, saying it would probably take 10 or 15 minutes to get enough charge to call a ride. My phone screen lit up when I connected it, showing 2% battery, and I felt this wave of relief that quickly faded when I realized I had no signal bars at all, which was strange since I'd had full bars outside. The man was already at the coffee maker, pressing buttons and pulling out mugs from a cabinet, not really waiting for my answer about wanting any, just assuming I did, and humming something I didn't recognize while he worked. I mentioned the signal issue and he laughed, not rudely, but like he'd heard this complaint before, explaining that the house had thick walls from the original construction in the 60s, something about lead paint layers and renovations that created dead zones, but he had Wi-Fi I could connect to for calling through an app. He rattled off the Wi-Fi password from memory, a long string of numbers and letters that seemed random, and I typed it in while he poured coffee into 2 identical white mugs, the liquid so dark it looked like motor oil. The Wi-Fi connected, but my phone stayed at 2%, not charging at all even though the lightning bolt symbol showed it was plugged in, and when I unplugged and reconnected it, same thing. The percentage actually dropped to 1. Panic started creeping in when my screen went black completely, the battery finally dead, and I immediately stood up saying I should probably just walk home. It wasn't that far, and I'd sobered up quite a bit already. The man set down the coffee mug he'd prepared for me, steam still rising from it, and his expression changed just slightly. Not angry exactly, but disappointed maybe. Like I'd been rude refusing his hospitality. He suggested I use his landline instead, pointing to an old beige phone mounted on the kitchen wall that I hadn't noticed before, saying cell phones were so unreliable anyway, always dying at the worst moments. But when I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone, just this weird static hum, and he quickly explained it had been acting up lately. The phone company was supposed to come fix it, but hadn't shown up yet. Typical customer service these days, he said, with this dry laugh that didn't reach his eyes. That's when I really started noticing things that didn't add up, like how there were no dishes in the sink or dishwasher despite him living here, no mail or papers on any surface, no jacket or keys visible anywhere, and strangest of all, no sounds from outside even though we were just a few blocks from a massive party. The man was watching me notice these things, standing between me and the hallway that led back to the front door, not blocking it exactly, but positioned in a way that meant I'd have to pass very close to him to leave. He picked up the coffee mug again, extending it toward me with this insistent gesture, saying I should at least have some caffeine before walking home alone, that the neighborhood could be confusing at night, and I looked tired. Maybe I should sit back down for just a minute. His tone was still friendly on the surface, but there was something underneath it, This weird pressure, like when someone won't take no for an answer about something seemingly innocent, and my whole body was screaming at me to get out of that house immediately. I made myself laugh, this forced cheerful sound, and said, actually, I just remembered my roommate was probably wondering where I was. Better get going. Thanks so much for trying to help though, already moving toward the hallway while I talked. He stepped aside at the last second, but as I passed him, his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop me. And he said, wait. At least let him walk me home since it was so late. Wouldn't feel right letting me go alone. I yanked my arm away harder than necessary and practically ran down the hallway, hearing him following close behind, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. And when I reached the front door, the deadbolt was locked, the kind that needs a key from both sides, and my fingers fumbled with it for these endless seconds while he got closer. Still talking in that calm voice about being careful. The neighborhood wasn't as safe as it seemed. Lots of strangers around during parties. Finally, the lock clicked open and I burst out onto the porch, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. And I ran down his front path without looking back, hearing him call out something about being careful but not following past his doorway. The street was completely silent. No music from the party anymore, even though it was barely past 1 in the morning. Too early for everything to be over, and the darkness seemed thicker somehow, the streetlights creating these isolated pools of yellow that made the shadows between them look solid. I speed-walked toward the main road, my cat ears falling off somewhere along the way, not caring about anything except putting distance between me and that house. And it wasn't until I reached the party area and saw it was still in full swing, people everywhere and music blasting, that I realized the man's street had been weirdly soundproofed somehow, like it existed in its own bubble separate from everything else. I found Jenna 20 minutes later near the beer pong tables, drunk and happy, and completely unaware I'd been missing, time moving differently in party mode. And I borrowed her phone to get a ride home immediately, not explaining why I was so shaken up because I couldn't even process what had happened myself. The next morning I woke up feeling sick, not just hungover but genuinely ill thinking about that house. And when I told Jenna about it over breakfast, she got this confused look and said there were no houses with pumpkins on that particular street. She'd walked her dog there earlier that very morning, and specifically remembered thinking how weird it was that nobody on that block had decorated for Halloween at all. We actually drove back there together around noon, me insisting we find the house just to prove I wasn't crazy. But when we got to the street, every single house was different from what I remembered. Wrong colors, different porches, and definitely no beige house with burgundy shutters anywhere. It wasn't until 3 days later, when I was scrolling through the neighborhood Facebook group, that I saw the post that made everything click into place in the worst possible way. Someone had shared a news article from earlier that year about a man named Harold Brennan, who'd been arrested after his neighbor heard screaming from his basement and called the police, leading them to discover a woman who'd been held captive for 6 weeks. The article included his photo, and I nearly dropped my phone because it was him, the same warm smile and crinkled eyes, and the article said his house at 1847 Sycamore Lane had been empty since his arrest in February, the property tied up in legal proceedings. I searched the address and sure enough, Sycamore Lane was the street I'd been on that night. But when Jenna and I had driven there, 1847 was a completely different house, painted white with black shutters, and the neighbors later told reporters they'd been relieved when the city had finally arranged to have the original house demolished in August, after it became a target for vandalism. I called the police that same day, barely able to get the words out, telling them everything about Halloween night and the man who looked exactly like Harold Brennan, but the detective I spoke with pulled up the records and confirmed Brennan was still in custody, had been since February with no bail, currently awaiting trial at the county detention center 40 miles away. She suggested maybe I'd encountered someone who looked similar, that traumatic news stories sometimes make us see connections that aren't there. But she took my report anyway and said they'd have a patrol car check the area more frequently just in case. Never found out who that man really was or how I ended up in a house that shouldn't have existed. and I moved out of Cedar Heights 2 weeks later, breaking my lease early and eating the penalty because I couldn't walk past Sycamore Lane without feeling physically sick. Jenna still texts me sometimes, says the neighborhood is talking about making the Halloween party even bigger this year, but I deleted her last message without responding because even thinking about that night makes me want to check every lock in my apartment twice, and I still can't look at carved pumpkins without remembering that flickering triangle-eyed face glowing on the porch of a house that was demolished 2 months before I knocked on its door. I found Jenna 20 minutes later near the drink station, completely wasted and worried sick, saying she'd been texting me for an hour and even went back to check her apartment thinking I'd gone home. I told her my phone had died and I'd gotten lost. Nothing about the house or the man because in the safety of the crowd with all the lights and noise it already seemed unreal. Like maybe I'd overreacted to someone just trying to be helpful. We stayed another hour, Jenna insisting we dance to sober up before walking home, and I kept scanning the crowd expecting to see that man appear, but he never did. Around 3 in the morning, we finally left with her book club friends, all of us walking in a group back to Jenna's place where I crashed on her couch, not wanting to go back to my empty apartment alone. The next morning, I woke up to Jenna shaking me, her face pale, showing me something on her phone, a neighborhood Facebook post about police cars on Sycamore Lane, the street I'd been on, surrounding a beige house with burgundy shutters. The post said neighbors had been complaining about a smell and called for a wellness check, and when police entered they found evidence someone had been staying there illegally. The house supposedly vacant since February when the owner, a guy named Christopher Vaughn, had been arrested for false imprisonment and assault. The article Jenna found said he'd kept a woman locked in his basement for 3 days before she escaped, and he'd been in county jail awaiting trial, but apparently he'd been released on bail 2 weeks ago and nobody knew where he was. The police were now searching the house more thoroughly, and by afternoon the local news reported they'd found a hidden room in the basement, recently used, with restraints bolted to the wall and fresh scratches on the doorframe. They never found anyone inside, living or dead, just evidence someone had been preparing the space, stocking it with water bottles and energy bars, setting up a small chemical toilet in the corner, getting ready for another long-term guest. Halloween was always my favorite holiday until 2022, when everything changed in the span of 3 hours. I was renting a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor of Riverside Apartments, one of those complexes with the outdoor walkways and metal railings that rattle when anyone walks past. The divorce papers had been finalized that August, and at 37, I was learning how to live alone again after 15 years of marriage. Most nights I'd fall asleep watching cooking shows on my laptop, surrounded by half-empty takeout containers and work files from the accounting firm where I'd been putting in 60-hour weeks just to avoid the silence. That particular Halloween fell on a Monday, and I'd bought 2 bags of fun-size candy bars the night before, figuring I'd get maybe a dozen kids since most families in the building had moved out over the summer due to a rent increase. Around 7:30, just as I was settling in with leftover pad thai and debating whether to answer the door for trick-or-treaters at all, I heard this soft knocking. Not the usual excited pounding that kids do when they're hyped up on sugar and running from door to door. This was deliberate. 3 measured taps with perfect spacing between them. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a boy, maybe 11 or 12, wearing one of those vintage astronaut costumes with the silver fabric and the white helmet tucked under his arm. He was alone, which struck me as odd, since kids that age usually travel in packs on Halloween, especially in a complex where half the exterior lights had been broken for months. His face looked pale and sweaty, like he'd been running, and he kept glancing down the walkway toward the stairwell. I opened the door but kept the chain on, a habit from living in the city for so long. The boy looked directly at me with these gray eyes that seemed too focused for a kid his age, not darting around or looking at the ground the way children usually do when talking to strangers. "Could I have some water, please?" he asked, his voice hoarse and cracking slightly. "I've been walking for a while and my throat really hurts." No mention of trick-or-treating, no pillowcase or plastic pumpkin for collecting candy. Just him in that shiny astronaut suit that looked like something from a thrift store, standing perfectly still except for his fingers, which kept tapping against his thigh in this rhythmic pattern, thumb to each finger over and over. Behind him, I could hear the distant sounds of other kids laughing somewhere in the complex, their voices echoing off the concrete, but this boy seemed completely separate from all that Halloween chaos. The maternal instinct kicked in despite the strange feeling creeping up my spine. I told him to wait right there and went to the kitchen, leaving the door cracked open with the chain still on. My kitchen was maybe 15 feet from the front door, and I grabbed a plastic cup from the dishwasher, filled it with cold water from the filter pitcher, even dropped in a couple ice cubes because the kid looked genuinely overheated. The whole thing took maybe 45 seconds, definitely less than a minute, but when I came back to the door, the boy was gone. The walkway was empty in both directions, and unless he'd somehow vaulted over the railing to drop 4 stories, there was no way he could have made it to either stairwell that fast. The bag of candy I'd left by the door was still there, though it looked like it had been moved slightly, rotated so the opening faced the opposite direction. I stepped out onto the walkway, still holding that stupid cup of water with the ice cubes clinking against the plastic. The couple in 4B had their TV turned up loud enough that I could hear some action movie through their door, and downstairs a group of teenagers dressed as zombies were comparing their candy hauls under the flickering parking lot light. Nobody had seen a kid in an astronaut suit. When I went back inside, I almost didn't notice it at first. The candy bag felt the same weight when I picked it up to move it away from the door. But when I glanced inside to grab a piece for myself, there was no candy. Instead, there was a single sheet of paper folded into a perfect square, like those origami fortune tellers we used to make in middle school. My apartment door was still open, chain hanging loose, and I quickly shut it, turned the deadbolt, and slid the extra security bar I'd installed the previous month after someone had tried to jimmy the lock on 4G down the hall. The paper was ordinary notebook paper, 3-hole punched with blue lines and a red margin. When I unfolded it, I found a hand-drawn map of my apartment complex, surprisingly detailed and accurate. Every building was sketched out, labeled A through F, with the parking lots, the dumpster areas, even the little playground that had been cordoned off for repairs since September. My building, Building D, had a thick red circle drawn around it in what looked like crayon. But what made my knees go weak were the notes written in pencil along the margins, in handwriting that looked too neat and controlled for a child. Fire escape access. Ladder extends to 3rd floor. Maintenance closet, unlocked Wednesdays. Camera blind spot between D and E buildings. Security patrol, 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. only. At the bottom, in the same careful handwriting, 4th floor, corner unit. Sliding door, standard lock, no secondary security. My apartment has a small balcony access through a sliding glass door in the living room, and I immediately went to check it. The lock was engaged. The wooden dowel I kept in the track was still in place, but now I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. The gap between my balcony and the one next door, vacant unit 4D, was only about 3 feet. An adult could easily step across. The railing was low enough that someone tall could reach up from the balcony below. I pulled the vertical blinds closed so hard that one of the slats cracked. Then I called the police, though I knew how it would sound. A kid asked for water, disappeared quickly, and left a map in my candy bag. The dispatcher took my information, said they'd send someone when available. But Halloween night meant they were dealing with vandalism calls, drunk drivers, the usual holiday chaos. While waiting, I texted my sister in Oregon, my ex-husband, even though we hadn't spoken in weeks, anyone who might tell me I was overreacting. 20 minutes passed before I remembered the map mentioned something about Wednesdays and the maintenance closet. Today was Monday, which meant 2 days from now, someone thought that closet would be unlocked. I grabbed my phone and took pictures of the map, then noticed something else. In the top corner, barely visible, there was a number. 7. Just 7, written in the same pencil. Was it apartment 7? Building 7? There were only 6 buildings in the complex. I started pacing, checking the locks again, peering through the peephole every time I heard footsteps on the walkway. Around 8:40, more trick-or-treaters came by, their voices high and excited, but I didn't answer. I sat on my couch, gripping my phone, the map spread out on my coffee table next to a baseball bat I'd pulled from my bedroom closet. That's when I heard it. Not knocking this time, but a slow, deliberate scratching sound coming from my balcony door, like someone was running a key or a coin down the glass. The vertical blinds were closed, but through the thin gaps where they overlapped, I could see a shadow on my balcony. Not moving, just standing there. The security light that usually triggered with motion hadn't turned on, which meant whoever it was had been there long enough for it to time out, or they knew exactly where to stand to avoid the sensor. My phone showed 8:43, and my hands trembled as I dialed 911 again. This time I whispered that someone was on my 4th floor balcony, that I lived alone, that I needed help immediately. The dispatcher kept me on the line, said units were responding, stay away from the door, but their words felt hollow when the scratching stopped, and I heard the distinct sound of metal against metal. Someone was working on the lock. The wooden dowel in the track would stop the door from sliding, but for how long? I grabbed the baseball bat and my car keys, ready to run for the front door if needed. Then the shadow moved, and through those tiny gaps in the blinds I saw something silver catching the light. The astronaut costume. But the person wearing it was definitely not a child. The shoulders were too broad, the height all wrong, had to be close to 6 feet. As I watched, frozen in place despite every instinct screaming at me to run, the figure raised something to the glass, a piece of paper pressed flat against the door. Even through the blinds, I could make out large block letters written in black marker. 7 days. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow pulled back, and I heard footsteps on the balcony above mine. Then nothing. When the police arrived 12 minutes later, they found scuff marks on my balcony railing, fresh scratches on the glass door, and muddy footprints leading from the vacant unit next door. The officer, a woman named Gutierrez who looked exhausted from dealing with Halloween calls, took photos and filled out a report, but we both knew what this meant. Someone had been planning this, studying my routine, and they wanted me to know it. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Every sound made me jump, the ice maker, the neighbor's cat on the fire escape, the wind rattling the blinds I refused to open. I called in sick to work, installed a doorbell camera using a YouTube tutorial, and had 3 different locksmith quotes by Wednesday morning. But I kept thinking about that maintenance closet, the note about Wednesday, the 7 days. On Wednesday afternoon, I positioned myself in my car in the parking lot, where I could see the maintenance closet for Building D. At 2:17, a man in coveralls walked up to it, unlocked it with a key from a massive ring, grabbed some supplies, and left it propped open while he worked on a sink in a ground floor unit. Anyone could have walked in, taken photos of the key layouts on the board inside, maybe even made impressions. The man was there for 40 minutes, the door open the entire time. When he finally locked up and left, I sat there shaking, understanding now how easy it had been for someone to gather information about this place, about me, about everyone living here thinking they were safe behind their locks and chains. That night, Wednesday night, I packed a bag and went to a motel 40 miles away, paying cash, registering under a fake name. But I couldn't stop thinking about what 7 days meant. So on Sunday, exactly 7 days after Halloween, I drove back to check my apartment. The place looked untouched from the outside, but when I opened my door, there was another piece of paper on my kitchen counter. Impossible since I'd checked every lock before leaving. This one had a single sentence. Next year, answer the door faster. I moved out that week, broke my lease, lost my security deposit, didn't care. Later, I learned from a former neighbor that on November 7th, exactly 7 days after Halloween, there had been a break-in at Unit 2B. A single mother and her son, who just moved in that October. They'd been out trick-or-treating when someone had cased their apartment, then returned a week later. Nothing was taken, but they found maps of the complex in the kids' candy bag. The same detailed drawings, the same careful notes. The family moved out the next day, and by December, 6 more units were vacant. The complex changed management in January, installed real security cameras, hired actual guards instead of the fake patrol car that used to circle twice a night. But every Halloween now, wherever I live, I buy no candy, I answer no doors, and I triple-check my locks when October 31st comes around. October of 2017 was supposed to be memorable for all the right reasons. 5 of us from state had pooled our money together to rent this old Victorian house about 40 minutes from campus, planning the ultimate Halloween weekend bash. The place was perfect. 3 stories, wraparound porch, the kind of creaky wooden floors that added atmosphere without us even trying. My roommate Blake found it on some rental site, dirt cheap for a 3-night weekend because the owner just wanted someone in there while he traveled. The guy left us the keys under a ceramic frog by the front door and said we could have as many people over as we wanted, just no property damage. Blake and I drove up Friday afternoon with our buddies Nathan, Carlos, and this guy Josh from our economics class, who always brought the best speakers to parties. The basement light started acting up that first night, before anyone else had even arrived for Saturday's party. We were hauling cases of beer down those narrow wooden stairs when the single bulb at the bottom would suddenly click on, illuminating that damp concrete space with its low ceiling and stone walls that looked way older than the rest of the house. Nathan kept joking that we'd rented a haunted house by accident, doing this terrible ghost voice every time it happened. But Carlos, whose dad was an electrician, said old houses did this all the time, probably just vibrations from our footsteps triggering a loose connection somewhere in the walls. Made sense to me. The basement was mostly empty anyway, just some rusty lawn chairs stacked in the corner and a water heater that groaned, like it might give up any second. We stored the extra beer down there and pretty much forgot about it, though I noticed the light was on again when I grabbed ice from the garage around midnight. Saturday afternoon, people started rolling in around 3. By 6, we had maybe 50 people crammed into that house, music thumping so loud the windows rattled in their frames. Everyone came in costume. We had zombies doing keg stands in the kitchen, a group dressed as the cast of Stranger Things taking over the living room, and this girl Katie from my statistics class showed up in this incredibly detailed plague doctor outfit with the long beak mask and everything. The party was exactly what we'd hoped for. People kept wandering through all 3 floors, exploring the old house, taking pictures on the Gothic staircase. Blake had strung orange lights everywhere and put fake cobwebs in every doorway. Around 9, when things were really getting wild, Josh mentioned the basement light was doing its thing again, flashing on and off now, not just clicking on randomly. We laughed it off, figured maybe the bass from the speakers was rattling something loose down there. Katie was the one who went missing first, though we didn't realize it until much later. Her roommate Melissa found me in the kitchen around 11, asking if I'd seen her. Said Katie had gone looking for a bathroom maybe an hour ago and never came back. With that many people packed in the house, I figured she'd just gotten pulled into some conversation somewhere or maybe went outside for air. The house was getting pretty stuffy with all those bodies pressed together. Melissa seemed worried though, kept saying it wasn't like Katie to just disappear without saying anything, especially since they'd driven together. We did a quick walk through the main floors, checked the bathrooms, even went out to the porch where a bunch of people were smoking and passing around a bottle of whiskey. Nobody had seen her in a while. Josh suggested maybe she'd gotten sick and was lying down in one of the bedrooms upstairs. So Melissa went to check while I headed back to keep the beer pong tournament going in the dining room. The power went out just after midnight. 1 second the music was blasting. The next everything went dark and quiet except for people's confused shouting. The sudden silence was almost more startling than the darkness. Someone said the whole block was out, but when I stumbled to a window I could see lights on in houses down the street. Just us then. Blake used his phone flashlight to navigate to the kitchen where he'd seen a breaker box earlier. Most people thought it was part of the party at first, some kind of planned Halloween thing, but after about 10 minutes with no power, the mood shifted. People started leaving, using their phones to light the way to their cars. That's when Nathan noticed something weird. The basement light was on. Not flickering, not flashing, just steadily glowing down there while everything else in the house stayed dark. Carlos went down to check it out, figuring maybe there was a separate breaker down there we could flip. He was gone for maybe 5 minutes before he came back up, his face completely drained of color even in the dim light from our phones. The basement floor wasn't solid concrete like we'd thought. Carlos had noticed it when he went down there. In the far corner, partially hidden behind the water heater, a section of the floor was actually painted plywood made to look like concrete. He'd pushed on it with his foot, and it had shifted, revealing darkness underneath. We all went down together, 5 phone flashlights illuminating that cramped space. The plywood piece was maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, and when Blake pulled it completely aside, we found a narrow opening with a wooden ladder leading down into what looked like another room below the basement. The smell that came up was intense, body odor, rotting food, and something else, something stale and sick. Nathan aimed his light down and we could see sleeping bags down there, empty food containers, bottles filled with what looked like urine. Someone had been living under the house, probably had been there the whole time we were setting up for the party, the whole time we were hauling beer past this hidden entrance. Josh spotted the camera first. It was small, barely noticeable, mounted in the corner of that underground space with wires running up through a hole drilled in the floor joists. The wires disappeared into the walls, but when we traced them with our eyes, we realized they probably connected to the basement light. That's what had been triggering it. Motion sensor. Every time someone walked through the living room above, it would activate the light down here. Whoever was living in this space had been watching us, tracking our movements through the house. Blake started yelling for everyone to get out, just get out now, while Nathan called 911. The dispatcher kept asking him to slow down, to explain clearly what we'd found. But how do you explain something like this calmly? We had maybe 20 people still at the house by then, all of them drunk and confused, stumbling around in the dark trying to understand why we were screaming at them to leave. Melissa was crying, still asking about Katie, and that's when the real panic set in for me. What if Katie hadn't just wandered off? What if whoever had been living down there had taken her? The police showed up within 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. 4 cars at first, then more kept coming. They cleared everyone out of the house, took our names, started processing what they called a crime scene. The detective who questioned me, a woman named Diane Fowler with prematurely gray hair and these sharp blue eyes, kept asking about the timeline. When did we arrive? When did we first notice the light? When did Katie disappear? They brought in these huge floodlights and generators, lit up that whole basement like daylight. I watched from the front yard as they lowered 2 officers down into that hidden space. One of them came up fast, radio crackling, and within minutes they were calling for backup and a forensic team. Detective Fowler wouldn't tell us what they'd found, just kept saying it was an active investigation. But I heard one of the younger cops mention something about photographs taped to the walls down there. Dozens of them, all taken from that camera angle, showing people in the living room above, unaware they were being watched. They found Katie around 4 in the morning. She was alive, thank God, but barely conscious, hidden in a secondary crawl space that branched off from the main hidden room. Basically a narrow tunnel that ran under the foundation toward the back of the house. She'd been drugged with something, they never told us exactly what, but she had no memory of anything after going downstairs to look for the bathroom. The bathroom door was right next to the basement door, and in the dark, crowded house, she must have opened the wrong one. Whoever was down there had grabbed her the second she stepped into the basement. What really messed with my head was thinking about how this person had waited, had probably watched us through that camera all day, watched the party growing, watched people getting drunker and more careless. And then when the moment came, they'd acted. The police said based on the setup down there, the food supplies, the makeshift toilet, the battery packs for the camera, this person had been living under the house for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. The man they arrested was named Walter Grayson, 43 years old, no fixed address for the past 5 years. The detective called me Monday morning to tell me they'd caught him trying to get back into the house Sunday night, like he thought he could just return to his hiding spot even after everything that had happened. He'd been a tenant in that house 8 years ago, back when it was divided into apartments, and had apparently made a copy of the keys and discovered the crawl space while doing his own repairs when the landlord wouldn't fix things. After he got evicted for not paying rent, he'd started this pattern, waiting for the house to be rented short-term, then moving into his secret space when tourists or temporary renters were there. He'd enter when they were at work or out for the day, live beneath them and leave before the real tenants came back. The weekend rentals were perfect for him because people didn't know the house well enough to notice anything strange. He knew about our party because he'd been watching us set up since Friday, probably getting excited about all the potential victims who'd be too drunk to fight back, or even remember clearly what had happened to them. What still haunts me most is something Detective Fowler told me during a follow-up interview. They'd found journals down there, years worth of them, where Grayson had documented every person who'd stayed in the house. He had their routines memorized, when they showered, when they slept, what they watched on TV. He'd written about the sounds of their footsteps above him, how he could tell different people apart by the way they walked. There were entries about sneaking upstairs while people slept, standing in their bedrooms taking small items they'd never miss. A single sock, a pen, a phone charger. He called it collecting lives in his journal. Katie was supposed to be his boldest collection yet, grabbed right from the middle of a party. The police found 14 other missing person cases that matched his timeline and the house's rental history, though they couldn't prove anything beyond Katie. Some were probably just people who'd actually wandered off, but others, the ones who vanished without their cars, without their wallets, those cases got reopened. We all struggled with it differently afterward. Blake dropped out of school for a semester, couldn't handle being in enclosed spaces. Nathan became obsessed with checking every corner of every room he entered, lifting ceiling tiles, checking behind water heaters. Carlos threw himself into his studies but stopped going to any social events. Josh wouldn't talk about it at all, just completely shut down that part of his memory. And me, I graduated that December. Turned out my birth year being 1995 meant I'd crammed enough credits to finish early, and moved to Colorado where I took a job with a hotel chain doing property management. I inspect every single rental property now, really inspect them, because I know what people don't want to believe until it's too late. Sometimes the real horror isn't ghosts or demons or anything supernatural. Sometimes it's just a person living 3 feet below you, listening to every step you take, waiting for the perfect moment to make you part of their collection. Katie recovered physically but never came back to school. Last I heard from Melissa, she was living with her parents in Arizona, going to therapy twice a week, sleeping with 3 locks on her bedroom door. The house got demolished 6 months later. The owner claimed it was for renovation, but I think he knew no one would ever rent it again once the story got out. There's a parking lot there now, perfectly flat and paved, like those hidden spaces never existed at all. I was 41 that Halloween, stringing orange lights between the Thompsons' mailbox and mine, while Ben hollered instructions from his garage across the street. We'd been transforming Willow Court into our own horror attraction for 6 years running, ever since my daughter turned 11, and begged us to do something special for the neighborhood kids. The cul-de-sac made the perfect setup, 7 houses forming a natural dead end, with the wooded area behind creating this eerie backdrop that we never had to pay for. Ben handled the technical stuff, rigging speakers and trees and setting up motion sensors, while I coordinated the volunteers, mostly high school drama kids eager to earn community service hours. That morning in 2016, I'd gotten 37 text messages from parents confirming their kids' participation, plus 1 voicemail from someone with a gravelly voice saying he'd heard about our event and wanted to help. The way he said help stuck with me, drawn out almost like he was tasting the word. The call came through my landline, which should have struck me as unusual since we'd only posted about needing volunteers on the neighborhood Facebook page with my cell number. The man said his nephew lived in the area and told him we might need an extra hand, especially for the finale scene we'd been struggling to cast. Ben's brother had backed out last minute, supposed to be our chainsaw killer who'd chase kids toward the candy station, and I was desperate enough that when this guy offered to fill in, I jumped at it. He said he had his own costume, professional quality from his time working at a haunted attraction in Pennsylvania, and that he preferred to stay in character the whole night to really sell the experience. When I asked his name for our volunteer list, he paused for maybe 3 seconds before saying, "Just call him Tom." And there was something about that pause, like he was deciding what name to give me. I gave him the address, told him to arrive at 7 when we opened to the public, and felt this wave of relief mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite name at the time. Around 6:30, just as the sun was dropping behind the tree line and casting these long shadows across the street, I saw him walking up from the direction of the main road. Nobody had dropped him off. He'd just appeared at the entrance to our cul-de-sac carrying this old army surplus duffel bag, the olive green kind with brass buckles that looked like it had seen actual combat. He wore regular clothes, jeans, and a plain gray hoodie with the hood up despite it being maybe 65 degrees. And he moved with this deliberate pace. Not slow exactly, but measured, like each step was planned. My neighbor Gloria was setting up her witch cauldron with dry ice and she waved at him. But he didn't wave back, just kept walking straight toward the staging area we'd set up in Ben's garage. I remember thinking maybe he was just really focused getting into character early, but Gloria shot me this look afterward, raised eyebrows that said, "What's his deal?" And I just shrugged because what could I say? The guy's doing us a favor, right? When Tom reached the garage, he didn't introduce himself to anyone, didn't shake hands or make small talk with the other volunteers who were getting into their costumes and testing their props. He just found a corner near the back, set down his duffel bag, and started pulling out his outfit piece by piece with these precise, almost ritualistic movements. The mask came out first, and even from across the garage I could tell it wasn't some cheap Halloween store rubber thing. It was heavy-looking latex or silicone, painted in layers to create this diseased, rotting flesh effect, with actual depth to the wounds and scars. Glass eyes that caught the light in this unsettling way. The coveralls were next, splattered with what looked like real dried blood. Not the bright red corn syrup we used, but dark brown stains that had that stiff, crusty texture, and they fit him perfectly, like they'd been tailored. He changed right there in the corner without asking for privacy, and underneath his regular clothes he was already wearing this black underlayer, like he'd been preparing for hours before he even arrived. The chainsaw he pulled from the bag last made Ben actually stop what he was doing and stare. It was a Husqvarna, the orange and gray kind that actual loggers use, not the plastic prop we'd bought from the party store. And even though Tom had removed the chain, I could see the bare guide bar gleaming. The thing still looked lethal. Ben walked over, probably to tell him we couldn't use a real chainsaw for insurance reasons. But Tom just held up one finger without looking at him, a gesture that somehow made Ben stop mid-step. Tom proceeded to pour what smelled like actual gasoline into the tank, and when he pulled the cord, the engine roared to life with this deep guttural sound that vibrated through the garage floor and made everyone turn to look. He revved it once, twice, the noise so authentic it made my teeth hurt, then killed the engine and stood there in full costume, completely transformed into something that didn't belong in our suburban neighborhood. One of the teenage volunteers, a kid named Ryan who'd been doing zombie makeup, actually took a step backward. 7 o'clock came fast, and the first groups of kids started arriving. Little ones with their parents dressed as superheroes and princesses, carrying those plastic pumpkin buckets and pillowcases for candy. Tom had taken his position at the end of the trail without anyone telling him where to go, like he'd studied our setup beforehand. And from my spot near the entrance where I was doing crowd control and safety checks, I could hear his chainsaw starting up every few minutes, followed by screams that sounded genuinely terrified, rather than fun scared. After about the 10th group went through, Ben pulled me aside and said maybe we should check on how Tom was doing. Make sure he understood this was for families, not an adult-only extreme haunt. But I was stuck managing a situation with a mom whose 4-year-old was too scared to even enter the trail. And by the time I got free, Ben had gotten distracted by a blown fuse in one of our light displays, and neither of us made it back there to check on Tom until it was too late to prevent what happened next. It was the Anderson family that raised the first real alarm, not just concern or complaints about Tom being too intense, but genuine panic. They came running out of the exit, all 4 of them with Mr. Anderson carrying his 12-year-old daughter Sophia, who was hyperventilating so badly her lips were turning blue. His wife had their younger boy clutched against her chest, his Spider-Man mask torn and hanging around his neck, and she kept repeating, "He grabbed her, he actually grabbed her," while Mr. Anderson shouted for someone to call 911. I ran over with my first aid kit. We always kept one handy for scraped knees and such, while Ben tried to calm them down enough to understand what had happened. Through Sophia's gasping sobs and her parents' overlapping accounts, we pieced together that Tom hadn't stayed in his designated spot at the trail's end, but had followed their family through the woods section, getting closer with each turn, and when they'd tried to exit through the candy station, he'd reached out and caught Sophia's wrist, pulled her backward toward the trees, and only let go when her father had turned around and shoved him hard enough to knock him down. Ben and I exchanged this look, the kind where you both realize you've made a terrible mistake, and took off running toward the back of the trail. The path was narrow and winding, bordered by thick rhododendron bushes we'd strung with lights, and as we pushed through groups of confused kids and parents, I could hear that chainsaw roaring somewhere ahead but couldn't pinpoint the direction. The sound bounced off the houses and trees, creating this disorienting echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We found Tom's assigned station empty, just the fake cemetery set up with its foam tombstones and the plywood facade, but there were fresh boot prints in the mulch leading off the marked path into the actual woods. That's when we heard Lucy Kim, one of our teenage volunteers who was playing a ghost bride, screaming. Not her fake theatrical scream, but something raw and desperate. The sound cut through the night like broken glass, coming from deeper in the woods where the trail wasn't supposed to go, where we'd specifically put up caution tape and signs saying, "Do not enter," because the ground dropped off into a ravine about 50 yards in. We crashed through the underbrush, branches catching on our clothes, Ben shouting Lucy's name while I tried calling 911 on my phone, but my fingers were shaking so badly I kept hitting the wrong numbers. The chainsaw sound had stopped, replaced by this awful silence that was somehow worse, and then we saw them. Lucy was backed up against a massive oak tree, her white costume dress snagged on the bark, mascara streaming down her face in black rivers, and Tom was standing about 10 feet from her, perfectly still, head tilted at this unnatural angle like he was studying a specimen. The moonlight filtering through the trees hit his mask just right, making those glass eyes shine like wet stones, and he was holding something in his left hand that I couldn't quite make out at first. Lucy saw us and tried to run toward us, but Tom moved faster than seemed possible, closing the distance in 2 quick strides and catching her by the hair, yanking her back so hard she cried out. That's when I saw what was in his other hand, a zip tie, the heavy-duty kind police use, already formed into a loop. Ben didn't hesitate. He grabbed a fallen branch thick as a baseball bat and charged at Tom, swinging it like he was going for a home run. The branch connected with Tom's shoulder with this sick thudding sound, and Tom released Lucy, who scrambled toward me on her hands and knees, sobbing so hard she was choking on her own breath. Tom turned to face Ben, and even through that grotesque mask I could sense something changing in his posture, like an animal deciding whether to fight or flee. Ben was screaming at him, asking what the hell was wrong with him. Didn't he understand this was just a Halloween event? There were kids here, families. But Tom just stood there, breathing heavily through the mask, that chainsaw still idling on the ground where he'd set it down. Then we heard the sirens. Someone had already called the police, probably Mr. Anderson, and Tom's head snapped toward the sound. He looked back at us one more time, and I swear I could feel him memorizing our faces through those glass eyes, before he turned and ran deeper into the woods, moving through the trees like he knew exactly where he was going, like he'd mapped out an escape route beforehand. The police arrived within minutes, flooding our quiet street with flashing lights and static-filled radio chatter, turning our Halloween event into a crime scene. They shut everything down immediately, gathering all the volunteers and families who were still there into the Thompsons' front yard for statements, while K9 units headed into the woods after Tom. Lucy was taken away in an ambulance even though she insisted she was fine. The EMTs said she was in shock, needed to be evaluated at the hospital, and her parents followed behind in their car, both of them looking like they'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The detective in charge, a woman named Reeves with short gray hair and exhausted eyes, questioned me for over an hour about the phone call, how I'd found Tom, what information I'd gotten from him, and I felt sick realizing how little I actually knew about the man I'd let near all these kids. All I had was a first name that probably wasn't even real, a vague mention of Pennsylvania, and the memory of that gravelly voice saying he wanted to help. The guilt sat in my chest like a cold stone, especially when Reeves asked why I hadn't done a background check, hadn't asked for ID, hadn't done any of the basic safety measures that now seem so obvious. They found Tom's mask and coveralls about a quarter mile into the woods, discarded at the edge of the ravine along with the duffel bag. But Tom himself had vanished. The dogs lost his scent at a creek that ran along the bottom of the ravine, and even with helicopters searching until dawn, they found no trace of him. Inside the duffel bag, police discovered more zip ties, a roll of duct tape, a hunting knife with a 7-inch blade, and a bottle of chloroform. Actual chloroform, not prop supplies, not costume accessories, but tools for something much worse than scaring kids on Halloween. There was also a spiral notebook with pages of what looked like surveillance notes. Our addresses, the layout of the cul-de-sac sketched in detail, times when different neighbors left for work, which houses had dogs, which had security cameras, and a list of names. All teenage volunteers from our event with stars next to 3 of them, including Lucy Kim. The police wouldn't tell us what else they found in that notebook, just kept asking if we'd noticed anyone watching the neighborhood in the weeks before Halloween, if any of the teenagers had mentioned feeling followed or uncomfortable. And the answer was no, we'd noticed nothing. We'd been too busy planning our innocent little Halloween trail to realize a predator had been planning something of his own. October has always been my favorite month, probably because my birthday falls right before Halloween, which meant double the celebrations when I turned 31 just last week. Living in Millbrook meant embracing all those small-town traditions that make you feel like you're part of something bigger, something wholesome. Our neighborhood had this thing every October where we'd secretly leave little treat bags on porches with notes that said, "You've been sweet." Kind of like those chain letters, but actually fun. The idea was simple. You'd sneak up to someone's porch after dark, leave the bag, ring the doorbell and run like hell before they could see who it was. Then they'd do the same for someone else, and by Halloween night, pretty much everyone had gotten at least one surprise. I'd been doing this for 6 years straight since moving here after college, and honestly, the thrill of sneaking around in the dark with candy never got old. That particular Monday evening felt perfect for continuing the tradition. Crisp autumn air, leaves crunching underfoot, and just enough moonlight to navigate without a flashlight. I'd spent the afternoon assembling 12 treat bags, each one filled with those fancy caramels from the boutique candy shop downtown, mini chocolate bars, and homemade sugar cookies shaped like pumpkins that I'd stayed up until midnight decorating the night before. The Richardsons down the block had just had their first grandchild visit, so they got an extra big bag. Old Henry, who lived alone at the corner house, always acted grumpy, but I knew he secretly loved these surprises. Last year I saw him keeping all the "You've been sweet" notes in a little box on his mantle. Around 8:30, I loaded everything into my canvas tote bag, threw on my black hoodie, essential for porch sneaking, and headed out into the neighborhood. The streets were quiet except for the occasional dog barking and the distant sound of television laughter seeping through windows. Making my rounds took about an hour and a half, ducking behind bushes, timing my doorbell rings perfectly, and sprinting away while trying not to laugh at the confused voices calling out, "Hello, who's there?" behind me. The Andersons' golden retriever almost blew my cover when he started barking excitedly through their front window, recognizing me even in my sneaky getup, but I managed to slip away before they came to investigate. By the time I hit my last house, the Nguyens at the end of Birch Drive, my legs were burning from all the running, and my face hurt from grinning so much. Mission accomplished. I headed home feeling that particular kind of satisfaction you get from doing something nice anonymously. The walk back seemed shorter somehow, maybe because I was already imagining everyone's reactions when they opened their doors tomorrow morning to find the treats I'd left behind. My little rental house welcomed me back with its familiar creaky porch steps and the jack-o'-lantern I'd carved 3 nights ago, still glowing cheerfully in the window. I was just settling in with a cup of chamomile tea and leftover cookie dough when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on my porch, followed by my doorbell ringing once, sharp and clear in the quiet night. My first thought was that someone had seen me during my delivery run and decided to return the favor immediately, which would actually be pretty cute. But when I opened the door, expecting to catch a glimpse of a neighbor hurrying away, the porch was completely empty, except for a single treat bag sitting perfectly centered on my welcome mat. The bag itself looked almost identical to the ones I'd made. Same brown paper, same orange and black ribbons, but heavier somehow when I picked it up. Inside were expensive-looking chocolates I didn't recognize, the kind with gold foil wrapping, along with what appeared to be homemade toffee pieces. The note attached said, "You've been sweet," in careful handwriting. Nothing unusual there, but underneath the candy was something that made me stop breathing for a second. It was a photograph printed on regular computer paper, showing me from earlier that night, canvas tote bag in hand, walking up to the Richardsons' porch. The photo was taken from across the street, probably with a phone based on the quality, and captured me mid-step with my hood up, clearly in stealth mode. At first I actually laughed. Someone had really committed to the prank, following me around to document my candy crimes. Maybe it was the Richardsons themselves, or their teenage son who was home from college. I even posted about it in our neighborhood Facebook group, making a joke about having a secret admirer with photography skills and asking who the clever prankster was. The responses were all laughing emojis and people guessing it might be various neighbors known for their sense of humor. I went to bed that night thinking the whole thing was actually pretty creative, already planning how I might one-up them next year. But then Wednesday evening came, and with it another ring of my doorbell at exactly the same time. 8:43 I noticed, because I'd been watching the clock, half expecting something might happen. This time I ran to the door, determined to catch whoever was behind this, but again found only empty porch and another treat bag in the exact same spot. The contents were similar, fancy chocolates, homemade candy, the familiar note. But the photograph underneath made my throat go dry. This one showed me inside my own house, taken through my living room window the previous night. In the photo, I was clearly visible sitting on my couch, examining the first photograph, my face illuminated by the lamp beside me. The angle meant someone had been standing in my side yard, probably right next to the hydrangea bushes I'd planted last spring. The image was time-stamped at 9:17, which meant they'd been out there watching me react to their first delivery. I immediately went to check the windows, pulling all the curtains closed with shaking fingers, then grabbed my phone to call my friend Amanda, who lived 2 streets over. She came right away, bringing her husband Brett, and they spent an hour helping me check around the property for any signs of someone having been there. Brett found footprints in the mulch beneath the living room window, size 10 or 11 men's shoes based on the imprint, with a distinctive waffle pattern on the sole. Amanda suggested calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone left me candy and photos as part of what might still be an elaborate Halloween prank. The local cops would probably laugh it off, especially Officer Mills, who was known for telling everyone to stop being so paranoid about every little thing whenever someone reported something suspicious. Instead, Brett helped me install a motion sensor light I'd been meaning to put up for months, positioning it to cover the side yard completely. Amanda stayed the night, sleeping in my guest room after we'd double-checked every lock and moved a bookshelf in front of the sliding glass door in the back, just to be safe. We even came up with a plan where I'd text her every hour the next evening, and if I didn't respond within 10 minutes, she'd come over immediately. The whole thing felt surreal, like we were overreacting, but that photo of me in my own living room kept flashing in my mind every time I closed my eyes. The next day at work, I managed the accounts at a dental practice downtown. I couldn't focus on anything. Every patient who came in seemed suspicious. Every delivery person could be the photographer, and I found myself studying people's shoes, looking for that waffle pattern Brett had described. My co-worker Stacy kept asking if I was feeling all right, probably because I jumped every time the door chimed. By afternoon, I'd convinced myself it had to be someone from the neighborhood, someone who knew about our tradition and had taken it way too far. I made a mental list of possibilities. Craig from 2 houses down, who'd been acting weird since his divorce, the new couple who'd moved in last month and didn't really talk to anyone, or maybe those college kids renting the place on Oak Street who were always pulling pranks. But none of it quite fit. This felt too calculated, too patient. When evening came, I almost didn't go home, sitting in my car in the office parking lot until well past 7, dreading what might be waiting for me. Amanda met me at my house, and together we approached the front door like we were defusing a bomb. Sure enough, there it was. Another treat bag, same spot, same presentation. This time, though, I'd been prepared. The new motion light had triggered, and Amanda's husband had set up his hunting camera in the bushes across the street, the kind that takes photos when it detects movement. We were going to catch this creep. But when I opened the bag with trembling fingers, the photograph inside made me want to throw up. It showed me in my bedroom the night before, getting ready for bed, taken from outside my bedroom window, the one on the 2nd floor. The angle meant whoever took it had either used a ladder or climbed the massive oak tree in my backyard, the one whose branches reached toward my window. In the photo, I was mid-motion, pulling my shirt over my head, completely unaware I was being watched. The timestamp showed 11:23, which was at least an hour after Amanda and I had done our final check of the yard. They'd been out there while we were both in the house, while we thought we were safe. We called the police immediately this time, and 2 officers showed up within 20 minutes. Thankfully, not Officer Mills. They took the photographs, dusted the bag for fingerprints, and checked around the property with flashlights. One of them, a younger guy named Officer Daniels, found fresh scrapes on the oak tree's bark where someone had definitely climbed it recently. They took it seriously, especially after seeing the progression from street photo to window photo to bedroom photo. Officer Daniels suggested I stay somewhere else for a few nights while they increased patrols in the neighborhood, and Amanda didn't even let me argue. I was sleeping at her place starting right now. We packed a bag quickly, me grabbing random clothes while constantly checking the windows, expecting to see a face peering back at me. Brett came to help us load my car and noticed something that made us all stop talking. There were fresh footprints under my bedroom window, the same waffle pattern, but this time they led to and from the tree in a direct line, like whoever it was wasn't even trying to hide their path anymore. That night at Amanda's, I barely slept, replaying every interaction I'd had over the past few weeks, trying to figure out who could be doing this. Around 3 in the morning, her phone rang. It was Officer Daniels. They'd caught someone in my backyard with a camera, trying to climb the oak tree again. My whole body went numb as he explained they had him in custody, and could I come down to the station in the morning to identify some items they'd found. When Amanda and I arrived at the police station at 8 sharp, I was expecting to see Craig, or maybe one of the college kids, even prepared myself for it to be someone I'd never suspected. But when Officer Daniels showed me the driver's license they'd taken from the suspect, I didn't recognize the face at all. Matthew Garrison, 43 years old, with an address from 2 towns over. He was completely unfamiliar, just an average-looking man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, someone you'd pass in a grocery store without a second glance. The officer explained that Garrison had been carrying a camera with a telephoto lens, a folder containing dozens of photos of me going back 3 weeks, and a notebook where he'd written down my daily schedule in disturbing detail. The real shock came when they told me how he'd found me. Garrison worked at the candy shop downtown, the same boutique place where I'd been buying caramels for my treat bags for years. He'd been tracking my purchases, had overheard me talking about the neighborhood tradition with the shop owner, and had apparently been planning this whole thing since early October. He'd followed me home one day after I'd bought supplies, figured out where I lived, and had been watching me ever since, learning my routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity to insert himself into the Halloween tradition. The police found his car parked 3 blocks away with more surveillance equipment, including night vision goggles and a police scanner he'd been using to monitor when patrols would be in the area. He'd told them during questioning that he thought we had a connection, because I always smiled when buying candy, that the tradition was our special thing, and he wanted to be part of it. The detective said stalkers often create elaborate fantasies about their victims based on the smallest interactions, turning normal customer service friendliness into something it never was. They charged him with stalking, trespassing, and voyeurism, and I got a restraining order that same day. It's been 3 months now, and Garrison took a plea deal. 18 months in jail, mandatory psychological counseling, and he's banned from coming within 500 feet of me or my neighborhood. I moved to a different rental on the other side of town, one with better security and no big trees near the windows. The hardest part wasn't the moving or even the fear that lingered for weeks after. It was losing something I genuinely loved. This past Halloween, our old neighborhood still did the treat bag tradition, Amanda told me, but I couldn't bring myself to participate. I can't walk into any candy shop without checking who's behind the counter first, and I still close my curtains the second it gets dark outside. My therapist says it'll get easier with time, that eventually I'll be able to separate what happened from the innocent tradition it corrupted. Maybe she's right, but for now, October just feels different, heavier somehow. The other day I was at the grocery store and saw those same fancy caramels I used to buy, and I just stood there for a full minute, remembering how something so simple and sweet got twisted into something that still makes me check my locks 3 times before bed. Brett installed security cameras at my new place last week, and honestly, seeing my own porch on the monitor gives me more comfort than I want to admit. At least now if someone leaves something at my door, I'll see exactly who it is. The fluorescent lights in my office were giving me another headache that Friday afternoon, when my coworker Paul swung by my cubicle, talking about some Halloween bar crawl happening downtown. October had been brutal. 60-hour weeks trying to meet quarterly deadlines. My boss breathing down my neck about the Ferguson account, and I hadn't been out in what felt like months. Paul kept insisting it would be good for me, that I needed to blow off some steam. And honestly, after staring at spreadsheets since 7 that morning, the idea of just one beer in a crowded bar full of people in ridiculous costumes started sounding pretty appealing. I told myself I'd go for an hour, maybe 2 tops, have a drink, laugh at some costumes, and be home by midnight. The event was hitting 5 different bars on Washington Street, and by the time I got there around 9:30, the sidewalks were already packed with zombies, witches, and at least 3 guys dressed as inflatable dinosaurs stumbling between venues. I squeezed into the second bar on the route, this place called the Black Cat that I'd never been to before, and immediately got hit with a wall of noise, some remix of Monster Mash mixed with modern bass that made the floor vibrate under my feet. The whole place was decorated with fake cobwebs and those holographic decorations that shift when you move your head, making everything feel slightly unreal. I managed to elbow my way to the bar and ordered a beer, watching this girl dressed as Beetlejuice argue with her boyfriend who was supposed to be Lydia. but had clearly given up on his wig about 3 drinks ago. That's when this guy sidled up next to me at the bar, wearing what looked like a legit police uniform, complete with badge, radio, and even handcuffs on his belt. He had this easy confidence, leaning against the bar like he owned the place, and when he caught me looking at his costume, he grinned and said something about being on unofficial duty for the night, making sure everyone was having a good time. Something about the way he said it made me laugh, and before I knew it, we were talking about how Halloween in the city had gotten crazier every year, how neither of us could believe some of the costumes people were wearing. He introduced himself as Officer Mike, making air quotes around officer, and started telling me these wild stories about Halloween arrests he'd supposedly made in previous years. A guy dressed as a hot dog who tried to steal an actual hot dog cart, a woman in a T-Rex suit who got stuck in a revolving door and caused a 3-hour building evacuation. The stories were so specific and absurd that I found myself genuinely laughing for the first time in weeks, the stress from work finally starting to melt away. He had this way of maintaining the character while winking at the joke, occasionally pulling out his radio and pretending to respond to fake calls about costume emergencies around the city. When he offered to buy me a shot to commemorate my first citation-free Halloween, I actually considered saying no. I really did plan on just having 1 beer, but he was already flagging down the bartender, insisting it was tradition for cops to buy drinks for law-abiding citizens. The bartender, this woman with purple hair dressed as some kind of gothic fairy, poured 2 shots of something green that glowed under the black lights, and Mike raised his glass, making a toast to serving and protecting everyone's right to make questionable decisions in ridiculous costumes. The shot tasted like sour apple mixed with something medicinal. Not terrible, but definitely stronger than I expected. And I remember thinking I should probably get some water after this. Mike was already ordering another round of beers, sliding one toward me while launching into another story about breaking up a fight between 2 guys dressed as the same superhero who accused each other of costume theft. I was maybe halfway through that second beer when I noticed the room starting to tilt just slightly, like being on a boat in calm water. Barely perceptible, but definitely there. At first I figured it was just because I hadn't eaten since lunch, or maybe because I wasn't used to drinking anymore, after basically living at the office for the past 2 months. But then I tried to check the time on my phone and realized my pocket was empty, which was weird because I distinctly remembered putting it in my right front pocket after texting Paul that I'd made it to the bar. Mike noticed me patting my pockets and asked if everything was all right, that concerned cop expression on his face looking so genuine that I actually felt embarrassed, like I was bothering him with my problems. I told him I couldn't find my phone, and he immediately sprang into action, pulling out his flashlight, an actual police-grade flashlight that seemed way too authentic for a costume, and started helping me look around the floor near the bar. He was so helpful, so concerned, even flagging down the bartender to ask if anyone had turned in a phone, that I didn't notice when he casually suggested checking my back pocket for my wallet to make sure that was still there. Of course it wasn't, and the sudden realization that both my phone and wallet were gone hit me at the same time as another wave of dizziness, this one strong enough that I had to grab the edge of the bar to steady myself. Mike put his hand on my shoulder, steadying me, and I remember his fingers felt weirdly cold through my shirt, like he'd been holding a glass of ice water, and he was saying something about how pickpockets loved working these Halloween crowds, how I should file a report, how he knew a quiet spot where we could fill out the paperwork. His voice sounded like it was coming through cotton, muffled and distorted, and when I looked at his face, his features seemed to swim in and out of focus, that concerned expression never changing, like a mask that didn't quite match the words coming out of his mouth. The fairy bartender was suddenly there, asking if I was okay, and I tried to tell her about my missing stuff, but the words came out thick and jumbled, like my tongue had doubled in size. Mike was already explaining to her that I'd had a rough night, that someone had lifted my belongings, that he was going to help me outside to get some air and file a report. She looked between us, and I saw something flicker across her face, not quite suspicion, but something close, and she asked if she should call me a real cop. Mike laughed, this warm, reassuring sound that would have been comforting if the room hadn't been spinning faster now, and he showed her his badge, explained he was off duty, but still happy to help a fellow citizen in need. The badge looked so real in the swirling lights, the numbers and insignia catching the strobes in a way that made them seem to pulse and breathe. The bartender nodded slowly, but I noticed she kept watching us as Mike guided me away from the bar, his arm around my shoulders now, practically holding me up as my legs started to feel like they were made of wet sand. The crowd parted around us like water, all these painted faces and elaborate costumes becoming a blur of colors and shapes that made no sense anymore. I remember passing a group of women dressed as the Sanderson sisters from Hocus Pocus, and one of them looked right at me with these concerned eyes, her mouth moving like she was asking me something. But Mike just tightened his grip and kept moving us toward what I thought was the exit. We passed through a narrow hallway that smelled like stale beer and cleaning products, the music from the main room becoming muffled and distant, and I tried to ask where we were going, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate anymore. Mike kept talking in that steady, professional voice, something about getting my statement while everything was fresh, about how his car was right outside, how we'd have me sorted out in no time. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, the walls breathing in and out like lungs, and I noticed there were other people here too. A guy slumped against the wall dressed as a pirate, his face slack and confused, and Mike just stepped over his outstretched legs like he wasn't even there. The back exit opened into an alley that definitely wasn't Washington Street, just a narrow space between buildings with a dumpster that reeked of rotting food and a single flickering light that made everything look yellow and sick. There was a van parked there, just a regular white van with no windows in the back, and I felt this surge of absolute terror cut through the fog in my brain because even drugged, even barely conscious, something primal in me knew this was wrong, knew that getting in that van meant something horrible. I tried to pull away, but my body wouldn't respond right, my movements slow and uncoordinated like moving through thick syrup. Mike's grip was iron now, no longer pretending to be supportive, just dragging me toward the van's open back doors. That's when I saw them. Two other people already in there, both in costume, one dressed as a vampire and another as some kind of superhero I couldn't identify, both completely unconscious, arranged on the floor of the van like mannequins. Mike was saying something to someone I couldn't see, his voice different now, clipped and businesslike, using words like third pickup and clean grab, and I realized with perfect, horrible clarity that this wasn't random, wasn't opportunistic. This was planned, practiced, professional. My legs gave out completely just as we reached the van, and for a second I thought this was it, that I was going to end up on that floor with the others, heading to God knows where for God knows what purpose. But as Mike adjusted his grip to lift me, his radio, that stupidly authentic radio on his belt, caught on the edge of the van door and clattered to the ground, the plastic casing cracking open on the alley pavement. He cursed, a sharp, angry sound that didn't match Officer Mike's friendly persona at all, and had to let go of me with one hand to reach for it. In that split second, with adrenaline doing what my conscious mind couldn't, my body acted on pure instinct. I twisted hard and fell sideways, away from the van, hitting the ground next to that stinking dumpster. The impact sent a shock of pain through my shoulder that momentarily cleared some of the fog, and I started making noise. Not screaming exactly, because my throat wouldn't work right, but this loud, wordless groaning that echoed off the alley walls. Mike grabbed for me again, but then there were voices from the other end of the alley. Drunk people from the bar crawl who'd wandered back there to smoke or puke or make out, their laughter cutting through the night air like a siren. Everything happened fast after that, even though my brain was only processing it in fragments, like a movie with half the frames missing. Mike said something urgent to whoever was in the van. There was the sound of doors slamming, and then the engine roared to life, tires squealing as they reversed out of the alley so fast they nearly clipped the dumpster. I was still on the ground, trying to process what had just almost happened, when those drunk people found me. A group of college kids dressed as characters from The Office, their faces shifting from amused to alarmed when they saw me struggling to sit up. One of them, this girl with her hair in a Pam Beasley wig, kept asking if I was okay, if I needed help, while her friend dressed as Jim was already on his phone calling 911. I tried to explain about Mike, about the van, about the others inside, but everything came out as incomprehensible mumbling that just made them look more worried. They stayed with me though, formed this protective circle around me like they understood something bad had happened, even if they didn't know what, and one of them gave me water from a bottle that tasted like heaven after whatever Mike had put in my system. The real cops showed up maybe 10 minutes later, though time had become this elastic thing that made no sense anymore. They took me to the hospital where doctors ran tests and confirmed what everyone already suspected. I'd been drugged with something they called a cocktail, multiple substances designed to incapacitate without killing, professional grade stuff that would have knocked me out completely in another few minutes. The detective who interviewed me the next morning, after the drugs had worn off and I could speak in complete sentences again, told me they'd been tracking similar incidents for weeks, always at crowded events, always with someone posing as authority figures, cops, security guards, even EMTs. She showed me grainy security footage from the Black Cat, and there he was, Mike in his perfect costume, leading two other people out that same back exit about an hour after I'd escaped. One leaning on him like a drunk friend, the other being supported by someone else I hadn't even noticed in the bar, someone who must have been working with him the whole time. Both victims were found the next day in different parts of the city, alive but with no memory of anything after their second drink, their credit cards maxed out, their bank accounts emptied through ATM withdrawals they didn't remember making. The detective said I was lucky, that most victims never even realized they'd been drugged until they woke up somewhere else with their finances destroyed and their phones wiped clean. She said the crew was sophisticated, probably selling personal information on top of the immediate theft, that Mike's badge and uniform were so convincing even real cops had been fooled in the past. They never caught them as far as I know. The van had stolen plates, the bar's cameras couldn't get a clear shot of Mike's face under the strobe lights, and the other victims couldn't remember enough details to help. I still think about those two people in the van sometimes, wonder what happened to them after I escaped, if they woke up in some random location with that same sick confusion I felt, that violation of not knowing what had been done to them while they were unconscious. The detective told me to change all my passwords, freeze my credit, all the practical steps that felt hollow compared to the magnitude of what almost happened. But the thing that really haunts me, that makes me triple-check my drinks even now 3 years later, is how easy it was for him, how perfectly he played that role. How many other Officer Mikes might be out there right now, buying drinks for someone who just wanted one night away from their desk, one normal evening in a world that suddenly feels full of predators wearing the masks of protectors. It had been 2 years since the divorce finalized, and by then the quiet had stopped feeling strange. I had settled into my small house at the edge of town, a modest one-story place with peeling paint and a front porch light that buzzed when it rained. Halloween night had rolled in with steady wind, and the kind of chill that made the air smell faintly metallic. I had a bowl of candy on the counter, but not a single kid had shown up that year. I remember thinking how odd it felt. The whole street dim, no laughter, no footsteps, only the sound of dead leaves scraping across the driveway. Around 9 o'clock, there was a knock at the door, 3 short taps, then a pause, like someone deciding whether to continue. I hesitated because nobody ever came by unannounced. When I opened it, a woman stood under the porch light, makeup streaked down her cheeks like she'd been crying. She wore a beige coat buttoned up to her neck, and her hair clung to her face, slightly damp from the drizzle. She said her car had broken down nearby and asked if I could help. Her voice wavered, not weak exactly, but unsteady, like she was trying to sound calm and not quite pulling it off. I told her I could call a tow truck for her, maybe even wait outside while she stayed in the car to keep warm. She shook her head immediately, eyes darting toward the darkness behind her, then back at me. "I'd rather wait inside just for a bit," she said. That request didn't sit right with me. I was polite but firm, telling her I didn't feel comfortable letting strangers in. For a long moment she just stood there, the porch light flickering over her face. Her breathing slowed, and she stared directly at me, not angrily, not pleading, just still. The air between us felt heavy, like the night was holding its breath. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back down the path. No frustration, no sigh, just the sound of her heels clicking against the concrete until it faded into the wind. I stood there a few seconds longer before shutting the door and locking it, the kind of lock turn that feels louder when the house is too quiet. I went to the window, half expecting to see her walking toward the main road, but the street was empty. Only the porch light buzzed faintly, casting that soft orange halo on the wet pavement. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself she probably found another house with someone less cautious. About an hour passed before I noticed something strange. Through the living room window, I caught a glimpse of faint movement across the street, a shadow shifting just beyond the reach of the porch light. I pulled the curtain aside, thinking maybe the woman had come back. The sidewalk was empty, but my mailbox was slightly open, the lid tilted upward. I knew I had closed it that morning. A small, unreasonable chill worked its way down my spine, the kind that makes you question your own memory. I stood there for a while, scanning the quiet street, before finally letting the curtain fall. Later that night, I tried to focus on a movie, but my mind kept circling back to her face. There was something oddly deliberate about the way she stared at me before walking away. Not confused or desperate like someone stranded, but focused, like she was waiting for a particular reaction. Around midnight, I heard another sound at the front door, softer this time. It was not a knock, more like a single brush, a slow scrape along the wood. When I stepped closer, the noise stopped. I waited. Nothing. Just the hum of the porch light, and the faint whisper of wind pushing leaves against the siding. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat in the recliner near the window, keeping the television on mute for company. Every creak in the floorboards felt amplified, and I caught myself glancing toward the door every few minutes. Around 2 in the morning, headlights flashed briefly through the blinds, a police cruiser rolling down the street. I went outside, waving them down, feeling ridiculous but too uneasy to care. The officer listened patiently as I explained what had happened, jotting something in his notepad. When I described the woman and her broken-down car, he exchanged a quick look with his partner. They told me they had just come from checking out an abandoned vehicle 2 blocks away. The engine was cold, they said, and the keys were still in the ignition, no sign of anyone nearby. The detail that stuck with me most was how they said the driver's seat had been pushed all the way back, as if someone much taller had been sitting there. The officer asked if I wanted them to check my property just in case. I agreed without hesitation, following as they walked around the house with flashlights cutting through the fog. The beam landed on the edge of my driveway, where faint wet footprints led halfway up before vanishing near the porch. The officers followed the prints until they disappeared near the first porch step. There was no sign of anyone hiding, no tire marks, nothing disturbed around the yard. One of them told me to keep my doors locked and to call immediately if anything else happened. After they left, I stood on the porch for a while listening. The neighborhood was absolutely silent, the kind of silence that feels too deliberate, like even the wind was waiting for something. I went back inside, double-checked the locks, and left every light on. It was nearly dawn before I managed to sit down again. When I finally drifted towards sleep, a faint tapping came from the kitchen window. Not loud, just the rhythmic kind that mimics branches against glass. Except there were no trees close enough to reach that side of the house. I froze halfway across the hallway, eyes fixed on the blinds. The tapping stopped. Then came a soft scrape, lower this time, like someone dragging their fingernails across the siding. I whispered out loud that I had called the police and that they were on their way, hoping my voice would scare off whoever it was. The sound stopped instantly. I waited there for what felt like minutes before pulling the blinds open. Nothing. Just the reflection of my own face, pale under the kitchen light. The next morning, I found something sitting on the porch step. A single car key, silver and wet with dew. I knew it was not mine. I drive an old pickup that takes a different type of key entirely. The police came again, took it with them, and told me they would run it through their report on the abandoned vehicle. Later that day, they called to confirm it matched the car they had found. They never located the woman, and no missing person reports matched her description. The tow company removed the car from the neighborhood by evening, and that was the last anyone ever mentioned it. I still live in the same house, though I replaced the old porch light with a motion sensor one. Every Halloween since, it flickers at least once during the night, even when nobody is there. I tell myself it is the wiring, the same faulty buzz I kept meaning to fix. But each year, when the air turns sharp and the leaves start piling against the fence, I catch myself glancing toward the road, half expecting to see a figure in a beige coat, standing under that faint orange glow, waiting silently by the driveway. It was one of those chilly Halloween evenings where the air feels sharp and dry, and every porch light seems to hum louder than usual. I had agreed to babysit for a couple who lived across the street, the kind of people who always waved but never really talked. Their daughter, Emma, was 7, quiet most of the time except when she was talking about costumes or candy. Her parents were going to a neighborhood party and asked if I could take Emma trick-or-treating in the new subdivision a few blocks away. I did not think much of it. I had done plenty of babysitting jobs, and it sounded like an easy night. The new subdivision was still half empty, with unfinished lawns and houses that looked copied from the same catalog. As we walked from door to door, Emma held my hand tightly, but never seemed scared. She was dressed as a fairy, glitter dusting her hair, her little plastic wings catching the porch lights. She was polite, always saying thank you, and by the 5th house, her bucket was already heavy with candy. I remember thinking how quiet the area was compared to our street. No dogs barking, no music, just the soft thud of our shoes on the pavement. At some point, Emma tugged at my sleeve and pointed ahead. "They give toys instead of candy," she said, her voice full of excitement. The house she meant sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, completely dark. No porch light, no decorations, not even the faint flicker of a TV inside. I hesitated, told her maybe they were not participating this year, but she insisted, her small hand squeezing mine. Something in her tone, almost like certainty, made me uneasy. She was so sure of it, like she had been there before. I walked her up the path anyway, figuring maybe the owners were just running late, turning on the light. The door was tall, the kind with a narrow frosted window beside it. Emma knocked twice and looked up at me, grinning, waiting. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, from inside, I heard the sound of a latch turning. The door opened just enough to show a sliver of darkness beyond. No face, no greeting. A hand, a pale one, reached out and dropped something small into Emma's bucket before the door shut again. Emma seemed delighted, shaking her bucket to hear the small object rattle among the candy. I tried to make out what it was, but she said she wanted to wait until we got home to look. As we turned to leave, I glanced back at the door, hoping to see a porch light flick on or a curtain move. Nothing. Every window stayed black, the whole house blending into the shadows like it was part of the night itself. The street lamp at the corner flickered, and for a second I thought I saw movement behind the frosted glass panel, but it was too faint to tell. When we got back to her house, I helped Emma sort through the candy on the kitchen table while the clock ticked softly above us. Her parents were still out, and the house felt calm again, full of that post-Halloween warmth, wrappers crinkling, laughter fading in the distance. Emma finally reached for the small thing from the dark house. It was a tiny plastic horse, the kind that might come from a gumball machine. Only this one had its legs melted slightly, like it had been near heat. The details were strange too, the eyes painted solid black, no pupils, and a faint number etched on the belly. 4. I laughed nervously and said maybe it was just an old toy someone had thrown in as a joke, but she looked unconvinced. "They had more," she whispered, staring at the toy, "on the shelves." I asked what she meant, but she would not say anything else, only that they had given her the nicest one. It was an odd comment, but I did not push. Kids make up things all the time, and I figured she was just tired. After she fell asleep on the couch, I texted her parents to let them know everything was fine. About an hour later, the sound of footsteps outside the living room window broke the silence. Slow, deliberate, moving from the porch toward the side of the house. I turned off the TV and waited, thinking maybe it was a teenager cutting through the yard. Then came 3 knocks, soft but spaced perfectly apart, on the front door. No doorbell, no voice, just those knocks. I opened the curtains a fraction, and there was nothing. No one on the porch, no sign of movement on the street. I waited for a few minutes before deciding to check the porch. The wind had picked up, carrying dry leaves across the steps, and the street was empty. I locked the door again, turned off the porch light, and sat back down, pretending to read something on my phone while keeping my ear tuned to every sound. After a while, the quiet returned, but I could not shake the feeling that someone had been there. When the couple finally got home, I mentioned the knocks and they brushed it off, probably kids playing pranks. I left soon after, but that unease followed me all the way home. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to that new subdivision, wanting to see the dark house in daylight. The sky was gray, the streets nearly deserted except for a few workers trimming hedges. When I reached the end of the cul-de-sac, my stomach tightened. The lot was there, but the house was empty. The front door was boarded up, weeds crawling up the steps, windows coated in dust. There was a paper notice taped to the wood, dated months ago, saying the property was condemned. No signs of anyone living there, and definitely no fresh footprints near the porch. I went straight to the nearest construction crew and asked if someone had been working there recently. One of the men shrugged and said that place had been abandoned since before the street was even paved. "No one's supposed to go inside," he said. I just nodded, not wanting to sound crazy. When I got home, I texted Emma's parents to ask if she still had that toy horse. They said she did, and that it was gone missing the night before after she had taken it to bed. They thought maybe the dog carried it off, but their dog never went upstairs. That night, I kept replaying the sound of the latch turning, that soft click before the door opened. It had been too smooth, too deliberate to come from a broken lock. I do not know who or what was inside that house, but I know someone opened that door. The following Halloween, I avoided babysitting altogether. I stayed home, lights off, pretending not to be there when kids knocked. Every year since, when I see a dark house at the end of a street, I cross to the other side without thinking. Halloween night used to be my favorite time of year. My son, Evan, was 6 then, and I remember how excited he was to finally wear the homemade astronaut costume we had spent 2 weekends putting together. I had picked a busy downtown district because they were hosting a family-friendly trick-or-treat event, with lights strung across the streets and shop owners handing out candy from decorated storefronts. It was crowded, but in a good way. Parents laughing, kids comparing candy, music echoing between the buildings. For a single mom, it felt nice to be surrounded by people, to feel that sense of safety in numbers. We'd been walking for about an hour when a man with a camera hanging from his neck approached us near a bakery that had fake spider webs all over the windows. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a denim jacket and a lanyard with a laminated pass that read, "Community Event Photographer." He smiled politely and said he was collecting photos for a local Halloween blog, just candid shots of costumes around town. He even showed me the camera screen, photos of other families, some blurry, some genuinely good. It seemed harmless, and honestly, Evan looked adorable, so I agreed. The man crouched down to Evan's level and started taking several shots, asking him to hold out his candy bucket, look toward the lights, and pose with the big pumpkin display. His tone stayed friendly, a little too focused maybe, but I brushed it off. He thanked me afterward and handed me a small card with a web address written on it, saying the pictures might be posted there in a few days. I tucked it in my pocket, and we went on with the night. I did not think about it again until the next morning. When I woke up, Evan was still asleep, and I decided to check the blog out of curiosity. The site was pretty bare, just a few photos of kids in costumes and the man's name listed as Tommy P in the footer. But scrolling further, I noticed a link at the bottom that said more local shots. It redirected to a separate page that did not look like part of the same website. The layout was crude, filled with random images of children at events, playgrounds, grocery stores. My stomach tightened when I saw Evan's picture there, his astronaut costume, his candy bucket. But then I noticed something else in the reflection of the shop window behind him, part of our home address, printed on a sticker attached to my car parked across the street. My first thought was that maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe that sticker in the reflection was not actually mine. But the more I stared, the more undeniable it became. The last 3 digits of the address were visible, and the faint outline of my mailbox number appeared in the lower corner of the glass. My throat went dry. I refreshed the page several times, hoping it would disappear or that I had imagined it. It did not. The page had dozens of other photos, and beneath some of them were comments, cryptic, disturbing, talking about where the pictures had been taken, guessing neighborhoods, even identifying license plates. I shut my laptop and sat there for a while, listening to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen. It was one of those moments where your brain tries to make sense of something that does not fit the logic of your day-to-day life. I called the number on the business card he had given me, but it rang twice and then went straight to voicemail. I did not leave a message. Instead, I searched his name, Tommy P., but nothing came up except a few unrelated accounts. That was when the unease settled in. He had been pretending to be part of the community event, but there was no record of him anywhere. By the afternoon, I decided to contact the local police. The officer at the desk listened politely, but seemed unsure what they could do. He told me to file a report through their online portal and advised me to remove any identifying information from social media, just in case. He promised to forward the link to their cybercrime unit. I left the station feeling embarrassed for even going there, like I was overreacting. Still, I deleted my personal accounts that evening and kept Evan home from school the next day. Something about seeing his picture online like that had unsettled me too deeply to pretend everything was normal. That night, while washing dishes, I glanced out the window above the sink. Across the street, under the flickering streetlight, a figure stood near my car. He was not moving, just facing the vehicle, as if inspecting it. I turned off the faucet, waiting to see if maybe it was a neighbor or a delivery driver, but the longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. The man eventually stepped back into the shadows and walked toward the intersection without ever looking toward the house. I went outside later to check, and there was nothing there, except for the faint smudge of a fingerprint on the same rear window where my address sticker used to be. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every sound in the house felt sharper, more deliberate. Around midnight, I heard what I thought was gravel shifting outside my bedroom window. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. A minute passed, then another, and I convinced myself it might have been a raccoon or the wind. The next morning, though, I found small shoe prints in the damp soil near the bushes. They were adult-sized, and the pattern matched a pair of work boots. I had never seen prints like that near my home before. I sent another email to the officer who had taken my report and attached the screenshots of the website, along with the photos of the footprints. He replied hours later saying the cyber unit was still investigating, and suggested I contact the event organizers to confirm whether they had actually hired a photographer that night. When I reached out, the woman in charge told me they had no record of anyone named Tommy, no official photographer, and that several parents had reported a man with a camera acting oddly attentive toward their children. That was the first time I realized this might not have been an isolated situation. By the end of that week, the website with Evan's photo was gone. The link returned a blank error page, and even the original Halloween blog had been deleted. The officer followed up once more, saying the domain had been traced to an overseas server and that there was little chance of finding the individual behind it. He suggested installing motion lights around my house and keeping my car in the garage. I took his advice. I even replaced my mailbox and removed every trace of our address from anything visible outside. It has been 3 years since that Halloween, and nothing else has happened. But every October, when I take Evan trick-or-treating, I find myself scanning the crowd for cameras. Not the friendly kind people use to capture memories, but the ones that linger a moment too long. Maybe I am just being cautious, maybe paranoid. Still, I keep that business card in a drawer, creased, faded, and a reminder that even in a crowd full of laughter and costumes, someone might be watching for reasons you will never fully understand.